Thank you so much for coming on to the GBG webinar today. On behalf of GBG, I want to welcome you to this session. My name is Carol Hamilton. I'm responsible for our fraud and compliance solutions in EMEA here at GBG. Just to let you know, the session today is being recorded, and for those registered, you'll be sent a link following this webinar so you can watch again. We're running a series of webinars, 4 across the summer. This is the second of 4 today. The numerous challenges we're experiencing and seeing our customers face in fraud and compliance is really regularly reminding us of the need to collaborate to disrupt. For those who are less familiar with GBG, we are a global identity, fraud and compliance specialist. Our solutions help you understand who you're doing business with, verifying not just their legitimacy, but also allowing you to understand any risks they pose to your business. We help our customers make accurate and fast decisions across their customers' life cycles. Over the course of the webinars, you might hear the terms instinct or predator referred to. These are our 2 core solutions, so they're product names you might recognise. Those are our key fraud and compliance solutions that we have worked with over 40 customers around the globe to implement and deliver them value. The aim of those solutions is to help detect and prevent fraud and enable their compliance, all the while ensuring a frictionless customer experience for those of low risk in particular. So we have a series of 4 webinars. As I said, today we're on number 2. We're aiming to expose you to best practices in fraud and compliance at digital onboarding and application right through to transacting. I'm delighted to be joined by trusted industry colleagues who are experts in their role. So today the theme of our webinar is tackling the rise of fraud scams in an increasingly digital world, joined by 2 guest speakers and a colleague from GBG. So we're going to hear from Nick White from Citi and Nick Palmer from Group IB as to the types of scams they encounter and how it's possible to disrupt the scammer and prevent losses. So at this point, I'll pass to my colleague Max, who is going to kick off the session with a short poll. Thank you, Max.
Thank you, Carol. Yeah, as Carol said, we're now going to move on to our first poll of the webinar. So if we bring up the question. So the question is, in the next 12 months, do you expect that the number of cyber fraud attacks will increase? Will they decrease, remain the same, or will it be extremely difficult to measure the change? So we'll let that hang for a few seconds or so, and then we'll comment on the results. Okay, so it looks like the results are coming back. Wow. So I think there's a clear winner in the fact that you all think the number of cyber fraud attacks will increase. Only a small percentage thinks that they will remain the same, and a few will think it's really hard to measure that change. So if we just touch on that top percentage of 90%. So I guess what my thoughts here, it's I guess we live in very uncertain times, and there's a clear movement of all of us at the moment. We're looking to consume products and services more so than ever digitally. So with that comes the threat of organised crime and fraud. And to back that up, I sort of reading an interesting Gartner stat, which estimates that banks and online commerce businesses by the year 2023 will actually increase their dedication of trust and safety for brand and customers by as much as 25%. So I do hope the insights of our speakers today can help you with your digital fraud prevention strategy. Before I move on to our next speaker, if you feel you would like to ask questions, please type them into the chat function and we'll aim to address these at the end of the webinar. But now I'll pass over to our first speaker, Nick White of Citibank. Over to you, Nick.
Thanks, Max, and good afternoon, everyone. So Let me start just by introducing myself. I won't spend long on that, but my name is Nick White, as been said, and I work for Citi's commercial bank, and I lead their global fraud prevention program. I've been working for Citi for 18 years now, about 10 years in fraud, and the last 4 years in commercial banking. So both of today's speakers are really interesting because we're going to be touching on the two sides of cyber fraud. So Nick is going to be talking more on the technological side, but I will be talking more about the human or psychological side. And the reason that I would spend talking about this is a real passion of mine, because over the last few years, we've seen huge advances in technology, and it's getting increasingly easy if you're using the right tools to spot the good guys from the bad guys. And so what we've started to see is fraudsters moving far more towards scams. And the reason for that is quite straightforward. It's becoming increasingly easy to hack a person as compared to a machine. So we're now seeing these human manipulation scams taking off. So if we could move to my next slide, please. Sorry, I'm not driving today, so I'll ask for the slides to be moved. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take you through what I would consider to be 4 key areas to make you aware of. Very, very simplistic in how I've laid them out, and I'll try and make the explanations as easy to understand as possible. So the first one is what I call the supplier scam. And this is a variation of business email compromise. And this is the most problematic, endemic, and successful of the cyber scams. So the FBI have reported that approximately $26 billion is known to have attempted to be stolen via business email compromise in the last 3 years alone. And the average loss is reported to be around $75,000. So we're talking large amounts of money here. So what this is in very simple terms, it is a criminal will send an email to a member of your business and ask that they send money to a new beneficiary. Sounds really, really straightforward. But it is, as I've just explained, incredibly successful. And UK businesses in particular, we are particularly at the sharp end of this. If you look back over the last 2 years, according to PwC's latest economic crime survey, 56% of UK businesses have lost money to e-crime in the last 2 years, which is about 20% higher than the global average. So it's something that we obviously really need to be aware of. The reason I've called this out for Supplier is the most common form of attack is for a fraudster to impersonate one of your suppliers and then send an email that looks like it has come from them and say, we need you to send the money to a new bank account. It is really that straightforward. And that is the problem that we are faced with. Now, in many instances, they will create lookalike email addresses so that it appears to be authentic, and you will often see just a single letter changed so that you really have to concentrate. But this is the scheme that they follow. The only other things that I would say is many of us expect it to be akin to cold calling, that it will just be through a clean email. But actually, what I see in an increasing number of cases is that the fraudsters are able to penetrate an existing email exchange. So you may already have been speaking to your supplier, arrange the dates, the cost, other logistical factors, and even perhaps even made a down payment before they contact you and ask for the payment to be changed. And all of this builds credibility, which makes it harder to spot. The next one is executive, and there are a few variations of this. And actually, when business email compromise first appeared, it was around the executive fraud. So it would be someone like the CEO, CFO, appearing to email a junior member of staff and saying, we urgently need a transfer. Perhaps there's a secret deal or an acquisition, and they would pressure that individual. And then because they felt this high-ranking member of the firm was asking them to do it, they didn't feel confident challenging it. And this was how BEC really started. But actually, it's moved on. And there's two variations to this that I would really highlight now. The traditional CEO fraud still can occur, but we've seen the most successful versions of this are starting to migrate to audio. So some of you will have heard of deep fake video, where using artificial intelligence, the fraudsters or anyone who wants to impersonate someone can create a lookalike video. So it would you could almost create a video that looks like I am saying something that I was not, or appear in a location where I wasn't. Deepfake audio uses the same way. You simply play an existing piece of audio through the AI software, and it creates a imitation of my accent, and it even is able to get the flow and tone right. So we've seen deepfake audio start to be used on these types of payment scams as well. And there was a well-documented case from September last year where a British company lost 220,000 euros because the individual thought that they were speaking to an executive on the continent. Very, very good lookalike. Sorry, sound alike. The other thing that we started to see reported now, and this is one that I just want to make you aware of, there's a criminal group who is dubbed Cosmic Links, and they are starting to be very successful, and they are doing business email compromise again, but they are impersonating an executive at another company. So they are particularly looking for acquisition deals, and they will then, when there is an acquisition, they will present to be a CEO or a C-level member on the company that is being bought, and they will liaise with their victim and convince them that the money needs to be sent to a new bank account. And they will often imitate a member of a legal firm, normally a genuine individual at a high-ranking firm, to add to make it more credible. So that's the next thing that I wanted to highlight. The third one I want to just mention is procurement. This is what we've seen being particularly problematic with the recent environment as a result of COVID. So there are certain goods that are now in scarce supply. We think mostly hand sanitizer, PPE, even through to respirators, but it can be anything where there's demand. So if we go back a couple of months, we all know the challenges you had in a UK supermarket if you wanted to get toilet roll or even flour for baking. Anytime there is something that is scarce, it gives the fraudsters an opportunity to move in there. And they will either imitate an existing supplier, or in a more common scenario, they will actually do something slightly different. And what they will do is they'll act as a middleman or a broker, and they will try to set up the deal. And they will offer it at either a discounted price, which I think gives us reason to be wary, but more likely the offer to deliver it in an expedited time frame. So if you're desperate for something and you can't get it, suddenly an offer that seems really good is an attractive proposition. And the last thing that I want to mention from the scam side is impersonation. So impersonation plays a factor in all of these cases that I've spoken about previously. But in these scenarios, I've spoken about you and your business actually being the victim. What I'm also pointing out is there could be a scenario where you as an individual or your firm is impersonated. And this can be incredibly damaging from a reputation perspective, and something that you very much need to be aware of. So in one of the recent supplier cases that I spoke about, a company that I was aware of was compromised. Their actual email infrastructure was compromised. And so the payment request that went out actually came from a genuine email from their company. And the fraudster actually persuaded the victim to send $8 million to a different bank account. And so you can imagine the reputational damage associated with this can be quite catastrophic. So now I've spent about 5 minutes scaring you. Let me move on and talk about what we can actually do to prevent some of these attacks. So if we could just move, great, thank you very much. Okay, so the good news is, while these are frightening, there are measures that we can all take to help protect ourselves and our businesses. So the first one is what I've called here research or building a profile. And I'll talk about this in two ways. So the first one is around the payments side of things. And that was covering either the executive or supplier scenarios. So what I'd encourage everyone to do, whether have it formally documented or more of a mental note, is to understand the people that you liaise with. So if you have a supplier, who normally sends the email? When do they normally send it? How do they write it, for example? You will tend to find that people have habits. We fall into routines. And let's say we send an email at 3 o'clock on a Friday. If that email suddenly comes at 7 o'clock on the Tuesday, that's a little bit different. And so we should naturally be wary. And so thinking about it this way, And then from the procurement side of things, it's about this new intermediary or person that you're liaising with. Start thinking about how long has a company been trading? What type of online presence do they have? Are they offering you their core product? How knowledgeable are they on the product that they're offering? And it's this type of due diligence that helps you protect yourself. As a general rule, if something feels too good to be true, it probably is. So we just need to be really wary to it. The next one is verify. And out of everything I'm going to say to you today, this is the single most important. So please remember this one. The best thing that you can do for any type of scam, and they're all involved getting you to send money to somewhere that you don't want to, is to pick up the telephone and call the individual back. Now, what we've seen is emails can be compromised quite easily, but actually, if you're calling back a known contact on a known number, it's a very easy way of verifying this. And there's a piece of research by a peer financial institution in the UK, and they found that 50% of UK businesses do not perform callbacks. They simply take the instruction at face value. And of the ones that do call back, 40% of those call back the telephone number in the email. And if they're good enough to get you to think the email's legitimate, they're smart enough to put a fake phone number in there. So that's only 3 out of 10 businesses do this, and this is leaving the majority very, very vulnerable. The next one is train your staff. Obviously, this one is one that I think, again, is critically important. Humans are quite good at spotting something that's wrong. We have quite good instincts, and we're able to establish if something doesn't feel right. But we need to have been given training to recognize those warning signs and know what to do with them. So who should they escalate them to? What does suspicious look like? Taking a few minutes to educate your staff, pointing them towards the materials, even watching a video like this is something that is incredibly important and will help protect your business. And the last one is something that I talk about very frequently, and it's a piece of advice I learned with the British Armed Forces on an exercise about 20 years ago. And it's called the 6 Ps: prior, preparation and planning prevent poor performance. Quite simply, if you don't have a plan, you're going to have to make important decisions on the fly, and that increases the likelihood that you will get something wrong. So the reality is, I've said 56% of businesses have been breached in the last 2 years. The reality is the rest will in the near term, if you haven't been already, that you're not aware of. It's not a case of simply prevention and detection. The response is really, really important. So think about who you need to contact, and that's really important now. In the olden days, we could just walk through the office, knock on someone's door, and an easy resolution. Many of us are now working remotely. It's not just a case of popping into someone's office. So have it documented. Who do you need to contact, when, and what should you do? And the last thing, contact your bank as soon as you can. We, as a financial industry, we are able to help you recover money, but we need you to tell us so we can act quickly. And it's a cliche, but every second counts. The sooner you let us know, the greater the chances of us being able to recover money for you. And the last thing, don't be afraid to use the F word. Many people don't want to say fraud. They are naturally embarrassed. Perhaps there's a bit of a stigma associated with it. But if you don't use the word fraud, we cannot do everything within our power to get you that money back. So take the time to have a plan and know who to contact, and then reach out to us, and Citi or any other financial institution will then help you try to get your money back. So that's my side of things. Thank you very much. And I think I'll pass over to Nick now.
Yeah, nice segue.
Great. Thank you very much, Nick, for the interesting introduction. I think it's really exciting to have someone from the financial services sector that maybe looks at the issues regarding fraud maybe a little bit differently than a company like Group IB. So it was interesting to hear about some of the things you said, and I think it leads really well into my presentation today. So I'll present today on digital fraud in the new world. Obviously, in the last couple of months, many things have changed. I think the interaction with your customers has become primarily online. And Group IB, as a company, we focus on cybercrime and researching cybercrime and cybercriminals, their tools and techniques, and of course, developing preventative mechanisms in order to help different organizations to, like Nick said, build a profile of your customer, and also to verify if, of course, that is your customer before you send money to them. So my name is Nick, and that's what I'll take you through today. And maybe we could proceed to the next slide and have a journey of what the cyber criminal world looks like from a fraud perspective. So if you haven't heard about Group IB before, we have about 17 years experience specifically researching financial crimes. So we believe at Group IB that all crimes in the cyber world really at the end of the day are committed by people, cyber criminals, mind you, but they all have tendencies, they all have behaviors, and these are researchable. And as Nick said, there's mechanisms that you can put in place in order to verify if who that person is really the person you believe it to be. And we'll proceed to the next slide and get right into some of the content as well. So one of the really cool elements that Nick was previously speaking about was business email compromise, and really how prevalent it is amongst different businesses. 56% of businesses have lost money from fraudulent attacks, and I think this is really an astonishing number. And it is really that easy. And I wanted to show you some real examples of how cyber criminals can gain access to your email system. What you see here on your screen, if you look at the example that I have open, it says gmail.com. And when I put this presentation together, it was the day of, but on June 29th. And you can see a login and password that, of course, we hashed over, so we can't see it. But because of the research that we conduct, you can see that we've understood that cyber criminals have actually gotten access to this person's Gmail account. The tool here you can see is Pony Form Grabber. So this is a simple malware that scrapes username and password combinations from people's web interfaces or browsers when they visit their email client. Now, you can see on the right-hand side really how frequently this happens. You can see with Pony Form Grabber, it's happened over 38,000 times within the last year. So this is really obviously quite a substantial number. And you can imagine what does the cyber criminal actually do with this information now? Obviously, in the things that Nick mentioned, he might want to look at some of the emails, maybe start to interact. But cyber criminals, they're inherently lazy, like people. They like to do things in an automated fashion. So they'll actually write different parsers to look for keywords like invoice or payment or something that's of interest to them before then they get into the BEC world where they might want to start an interaction with that person who's requesting an invoice or payment in order to send it to another organization. So I think the point that Nick mentioned about verify that individual, ask questions when you're on the phone with them, find out how well they know their products, as Nick mentioned. These are all really important elements, a few quick questions that can give you the gut check of really if that is truly your customer. And I just wanted to show you really how easy it is for cyber criminals to gain access to your personal emails or business emails to conduct this activities. And on the next slide, we'll proceed to talk a little bit about how to actually detect and prevent against that. So really, cyber criminals are using tools, they're using automation, and we, of course, on the good side, have such tools and automation as well in order to really identify if that truly is your customer. So here are some of the different defensive mechanisms in order to detect multiple login attempts to different online accounts. So let's say that you run an e-commerce shop or an online bank, and you typically have a customer who would log into that bank or e-commerce platform. And in order to detect if that is truly your customer, you need to verify them. And you can verify them using different tools. So collecting different elements about their behavior. How does their cursor normally move when they visit a web page? What does their typing cadence look like? What type of browser do they normally log into the web portal with? From which IP address? Many other technical elements you can use to collect from digital traces that are non-identifiable of your customer. So you're, of course, complying with different local and international regulations, but it allows you, by collecting these technical details about your customer, to develop a fingerprint, or to develop, to use Nick words, a verification of that, if that is actually your customer or if it is not, and perhaps if you have to escalate that particular user session or transaction to see if you want to mitigate it. Another thing that you can do is look at different open source and private source threat intelligence information. So what I showed you on the previous slide is information about compromised credentials, and you can acquire this yourself as an analyst in many open sources, and also through different sharing organizations as well, as speaking to organizations like GBG to see if you can acquire that information and remediate that compromised password before it's taken advantage of by different cyber criminals. And if we go to the next slide, what we'll actually see here is really what type of technology is available to cyber criminals. So yes, advanced cyber criminals do conduct these attacks, but more and more cyber crime is available for people that don't have the most advanced technical capabilities. I think if you look at the global world that we're living in today, unfortunately, a lot of skilled technical people maybe have lost work or otherwise, and they may unfortunately turn to cybercrime. And it is actually extremely easy to do so, unfortunately. And on basically the right-hand side of the screenshot, you can see one of many such examples of different marketplaces where people, maybe not necessarily cyber criminals yet, can purchase ready-to-use tools like bots or malware in order to infect different computers when they visit a website. And they all have different capabilities built in, so the technical capability of that criminal doesn't have to be advanced. You can see in this particular example of a bot being sold, it has the ability to establish command and control communication, so communication with the person who is using that tool. It has capability to do web injects, so to serve up a web page to individuals, maybe to intercept their two-factor authentication. So these tools are really readily available for people on underground forums, and these people don't have to be extremely skilled in nature to use them from a technical perspective. So if we'll proceed to the next slide, what we'll actually look at is what is online shopping these days. I mean, if you're running an online e-commerce page, I think there's many different tools out there that cyber criminals are using in order to steal your customers' payment card details, and of course to conduct fraud at a later date. And what you're seeing on your screen here now is basically a lot of red marks, but behind all of these red marks is information about a credit card. So how did this information come to be? You can see that the source here says JS sniffer enter. This is a different JavaScript sniffer or simple script that is installed on the source code of a web page, usually an e-commerce web page. And the cyber criminal will do that by identifying different vulnerabilities in a website. And it's all, again, automated processes. And once they're able to install this malicious code in the website, once the online customer visits the e-commerce page, they enter their payment card details. Unfortunately, that information with the malicious code on the page is actually stolen and sent to the cyber criminal's infrastructure. So it's really a prevalent attack. You can see on the right-hand side, again, the kind of frequency that this type of attack happens, and it's unfortunately increasing in nature, especially as your customers move online. So it's essential to put in place different defensive mechanisms against these automated attacks and integrate with a solution like GBG so you can detect this type of malicious experience for the customer in real time and hopefully prevent fraud. And last but not least, on the next slide, I wanted to just kind of show you one of the trends that's occurring recently. I think the cyber fraud market for unskilled fraudsters is available, but also the fraud landscape is changing. We actually see some nation state threat actors, or basically cyber criminals that may be sponsored by some state. These types of nation state threat actors are actually turning to fraud in order to fund their operations that they might need. And here you can see a public example of this actually happening with the North Korean hacking group called Lazarus actually starting to utilize this JavaScript sniffer or Magecart infrastructure in order to steal credit card details and conduct fraudulent payments. So we actually see some nation state groups entering the fraud arena as well in order to profit, which I think is a really interesting trend. And I know Max and Carol will probably talk about this a little bit later, but it's definitely a trend that should spark interest from people that are interested in defending against fraud, because if we see nation states starting to take interest in fraud and fraudulent attacks, we can be assured that the tools and techniques that might be employed to do so might also become a little bit more advanced in the future. So thank you very much, and happy days fighting fraud.
Yeah, thank you, Nicholas. So yeah, we now move on to our final poll of the webinar. So if we could bring up the question. So the question is, in terms of investment to deal with cyber fraud threats, what statement is true for you and your business? So are you aware but your priorities are focused elsewhere? Are you actively seeking a solution to deal with cyber fraud? Have you got a process in place but it could deal with improvements? Or are you completely satisfied with the current solution in place? So we'll let that hang for a few seconds and then we'll comment on the results.
Oh, mixed numbers coming in. Very interesting.
Okay. Okay, yep. So yeah, some very mixed numbers. So it seems like there are processes in place, but it seems like improvements can be made. Interestingly, a lot of people out there are seeking a solution. Only 14% are completely satisfied. So roughly 85% of the audience are aware of the situation, they need improvements, and potentially looking for a solution out there. So very interesting insights from the audience. Hopefully the insights from our speakers today have helped you in whatever discovery phase you're at. So thank you very much for that participation. So now I pass back to Carol Hamilton for some closing remarks, and post that we'll take some questions from the audience.
Thank you, Max, and thank you to both speakers. What fascinating insights you've given to us. So I've got 2 slides now, really, just to conclude some thoughts from our perspective, from GBG's perspective, and then we look forward to a Q&A session, which will form the last part of our webinar. So I think it's clear to say that, with the increased digital nature of our world and everyday life as consumers, the fraudsters and money launderers have had really great opportunity. If you consider, especially from a scam point of view, you used to be scammed at your doorstep or maybe on the phone. You can now be targeted on your device, multiple devices, not just through face-to-face and on phone, but via email and in all sorts of different ways. This has exploded the platforms on which the fraudsters can operate. And also, it's worth bearing in mind that we no longer are dealing with a physical human being in 3D walking into a bank branch trying to do something untoward. We're dealing with masked identities, and often very big, large groups of masked identities operating under the radar with technology to help them, where things can be automated and things can be can happen en masse to widen the impact that they have. It's really important from our perspective to be really including so much intelligence and data in the decision you're trying to make about whether a scam is potentially happening. And so the insights from Nick, first from Citi, described how a fraud scam can actually manifest in so many different types of ways. There's no one size fits all. And similarly from Nick Palmer from Group IB, we've seen that, you know, the data and intelligence you collect and gather to analyze is firstly very voluminous, and also it can vary, and it's so critical in that moment when you're trying to make a decision to stop and potentially prevent fraud or not. So the way that we would typically recommend working is by using a multi-layered approach, which is the one we use ourselves at GBG. This in particular for scams is so critical because it's incorporating all sorts of elements into that decision that you're making. Traditional approaches won't typically cut it for a fraud scam. To find fraud in a transaction, you often look at whether or not, let's say, an IP address is unusual for me, or something is indicating that someone has taken over my account and are using my details. But the problem with fraud scams is quite often the perpetrator, the person who's instigating that transaction, is actually the normal consumer like you or I, the everyday person who ends up being the victim. So in the data, with less third parties involved, it's often quite tricky to detect. So where Group IB was showing us how they're looking at that complex data that sits behind, so not just about the individual or the person carrying out the transaction, but where the money is going to, the way in which the transaction is being instigated, all that behavioural piece is really insightful. Think back to your doorstep to analyse the behaviour of a doorstep fraud scammer. You might include a few thoughts as you're opening the door to them. What's their behaviour like? How are they acting? What are they saying? What language are they using? What's their appearance like? You can assess that. But when someone's emailing you or someone's on the phone or acting digitally, we've got to realise we assess their behaviour in different ways. So it's very critical that we keep up and are incorporating the behavioural piece into an assessment that's being made. Because when normal people are carrying out those transactions, there's still a way to detect if that's a normal way for them to be transacting. So there's still definitely an opportunity to disrupt the fraud scammer. The final point I wanted to touch upon is that the cycles and the behaviors of the fraud scams are evolving, and so it's really insightful that first poll we saw about how you think this will only increase. So I think the collaborative nature of what we're doing today and generally talking across industry is really helpful to help you stay atop of trends and stay one step ahead. So at this point, to get further insights from our presenters, it would be great to turn to a Q&A. We've had a few questions. So Max, could you please lead the Q&A session?
Yeah, so yeah, we had quite a few questions come in. I could probably direct these to both Nick and Nicholas. So the first one we've had, please share your observations relative to trends and what the next 12 months will bring. So Nick White, do you want to answer that first?
Yeah, sure. So the good news is, while scams continue to evolve all of the time, and Carol touched on how they do manifest themselves slightly differently, the underlying themes are the same. And actually the controls that I'm promoting now, telephone callback to verify, make a checker, have two people look at financial transactions before releasing them, particularly to new beneficiaries, hasn't changed. And I'm not actually expecting anything significantly different in the scam space other than potentially the rise of deepfake audio, which I spoke about earlier. What I would say probably for me, for trends for people to think about, and I'm going to touch on two things that perhaps aren't as palatable when we think about fraud, because actually when we think about fraud, we like to think about people we don't know, external individuals, bad guys, bad girls sat in a dark room, where I think many of us have had this image of what the fraudster is going to look like, or the cyber criminal. The two things I'm going to talk about as potential threats to think about, first of all, is first party fraud. So this is your customers. If you look at PwC's economic crime survey again, then the number one perpetrators of fraud are the customers that you have for your business. Unfortunately, that is the reality. And we're in a very difficult environment now. COVID has put enormous strains on businesses across the world. And unfortunately, in desperate times, people take desperate measures. So that's something that we have to be aware of. The second one is around insider fraud, internal fraud, employee fraud. It's got various names, but I think we need to be mindful that we are in an environment that makes the risk of an insider fraud or an insider attack, if you're talking about cyber more generally, is increasing. So first of all, most of us, if not all of us, are working remotely, if not all the time, more frequently than we were before. And we now have employees performing activities at home that we would not have imagined of allowing them to do as little as 12 months ago. But have we considered the extra risk that creates? The second one is, in the same way that we're having difficult financial consequences with your customers, some of your staff will be as well. They will have family members who've been furloughed, laid off, etc. And the same thing's true in very difficult situations. People make difficult decisions to look after their family and sometimes their loved ones. And the last thing that we need to think about is our work environment has changed. I'm going to speak for myself, and I'm sure many of you will feel the same. There's been more of a blurring between personal and social life, and many of us are working longer hours. Some people feel aggrieved that they feel that they're being taken advantage of and they're entitled to more. Or you may be in a situation where unfortunately you've got to let people go. Companies are having to make these difficult situations. And again, when people feel aggrieved, badly done by, that increases the risk that individuals may make a poor ethical decision. So those are just a couple of things that I would highlight. Thanks, Nick. And Nicholas?
Yeah, I think it's always interesting to listen to the psychological aspect of the fraudster from my side. So thank you, Nick. Specifically, I would like to break it up probably into two different buckets: trends within threats, and then trends within prevention mechanisms as well. So certainly, as I mentioned during my presentation, the quantity or frequency at which rate we see attacks taking place has increased dramatically, over the last 4 months, specifically from an online fraud perspective, because this is where our area of expertise is. I wouldn't say that the tools or techniques used in order to conduct fraud has changed in any significant way during that kind of short time. The two things that we have seen change, aside obviously from the frequency at which fraud is conducted and the quantity, is who is conducting the fraud. I think during my presentation, I mentioned that nation state groups are starting to get into looking at fraud, whereas before they were, more interested in targeting financial institutions directly, trying to steal large amounts of funds through malicious transfers via SWIFT. Whereas now they're getting into the game of stealing payment card details. And maybe leading back into what Nick said about the psychology, it is difficult times around the world for many people, and I'm sure in North Korea it's probably very difficult. And now we see the cyber criminals who are sponsored by nation state in North Korea actually leading into different types of online fraud activity, which I think is really interesting to see. And of course, the next element is about the themes of fraud. So like what Nick said exactly, is that fraudsters tend to play on people's emotions. And during the changing world into the COVID world, fraudsters also changed their cover story essentially for their fraud schemes. They use COVID-related fraud emails to try and dupe people. They offered money during tough times. They actually started attacking some different organizations in the US that were offering the monthly stipend from the government to try and steal that. So fraudsters have adjusted the theme and theme of their attack strategy as well. I think one of the good things that we see on the preventative side in terms of trends is organizations certainly collaborating. We also work in the threat intelligence space, and so it's nice to see in the fraud space how organizations are starting to share knowledge about different types of online fraud trends and how to defeat those trends. So would definitely recommend that you get involved in, you know, the Merchant Risk Council or some other organization whereby you could learn about different types of attack trends and preventative mechanisms as well. And we see more organizations doing that. I think we're all in this together, both private and on the customer side, on the banking side as well. So it's always good to share information and different techniques. So you know, we can work together in this fight against fraud.
Thanks, Nicholas. Another one we just got in is to both of you. So start again with you, Nick. In your view, how has the profile of the fraudster evolved over recent years?
Enormously. So Nick's spoken about nation states a few times, and genuinely, when I first came into working in fraud, the idea that a country could target an individual or a small, medium-sized business was just incomprehensible. But that's the reality of it. And as well as the reasons that Nick has spoken about, which are absolutely true, we also need to sometimes think about overlaying international politics and particularly international sanctions. And if you can't move money legally because of sanctions regimes, sometimes you need to find ways of moving money in other ways that can move around that. So there are various reasons for that. But aside from the nation states, I'd actually say thinking about the individuals who perform fraud. So you speak about scams. Many of us would still probably have a slightly romanticized view of a scammer, perhaps a Michael Caine character from Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, very charming and debonair. Actually, things have moved on and moved on in two ways. So first of all, alongside the nation states, you have very large, sophisticated criminal syndicates who now operate in this space. So some of them commit the fraud themselves, and some of them provide the software or the goods or even the services that Nick described in his talk. So fraud as a service in that case. So these organizations have all the structure, resources, as some of these big, well-known names, but they obviously operate illegally. They can bring some of the best and brightest talent in direct from university. They can pay them huge wages, and they're not constricted by some of the rules and regulations that many businesses have to adhere to. So they have an advantage in that way. The other thing that I would say, and Carol spoke about the doorstep scams, and this is another thing that we tend to think about. The scammer will know you, they will be near, they will be local, they will watch you and get to understand how you operate. Well, they do watch you, they do understand how you operate, but they do this all remotely. And there is no reason to think that that individual has to be in the same town or even country as you. So one of the examples that I will give, again, is back to business email compromise. There was a very notable case a couple of years ago that reached the US courts last year, and the US Department of Justice placed criminal extradition proceedings against an individual who stole $100 million from two large, very well-known American fintech organizations. Now, the most interesting thing was that individual did not leave Lithuania. They were able to build up the profile and complete the attack and steal that volume of money without ever getting close. So that's another really good indicator of how things have changed in the profile of the attackers.
Yeah, and your viewpoint, Nicholas?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't have much to add about specifically nation state. I think we've talked about this one. It's certainly a concerning trend, but I think Nick covered that extremely well. One of the things I think that Nick touched on is the organization of cyber criminals. I mean, you know, we've been investigating cyber crimes for many, many years, and you know, have been involved with international law enforcement like Europol and other organizations to actually bring these guys to justice. And you know, it is true how well organized and well funded these organizations are. They have an office, they have hired young talent, they, you know, go out for coffee together, they operate like a real business. And I think one of the cool things that you can do here to disrupt it, yeah, it might not work immediately, but one of the good things that you guys can do, I think, around the world in different countries is to work with different universities, especially technical universities, to provide them knowledge about all the different opportunities that exist within the cybersecurity community and anti-fraud community. We do a few activities with different universities on a global scale because it obviously selfishly helps us to hire talent, and it's hard to do so in this world. But two, you convince those people at early stages to come over to the good side before they might get lured into doing something bad. And I think that brings me to the one point that I would like to mention about trends, and in terms of specifically the profile of the fraudster. Outside of the nation state activities, we see a lot of more lower level skilled people or beginners at the fraud game using crime as a service software from the criminal underground in order to conduct fraud. So, these fraud techniques aren't necessarily sophisticated in any way. They're old techniques, but they're readily available for maybe younger people who don't have a better avenue to make money at this point in time. So certainly a trend from that point of view in the profile of the actor.
Cool, thank you. Carol, any more time or?
Great. Well, I think we'll start to close the session. So thank you, Max, for hosting the Q&A, and thank you again to Nick from Citi and Group IB for participating today. On the next webinar, I'm going to get speakers with different names so that we don't have that challenge again. But no, I hope for all the audience it has been insightful and useful in whatever sort of role you're in. I think we've all heard about the technological avenues we can go down to help fight this problem, but also the educational piece as well that Nick from Citi touched upon at the start. It's too easy to try and apply blanket processes to try and prevent fraud. You can't just stop every person over 75 ever paying a new payee. It doesn't work like that. You'll have too many false positives. So let's educate in the first place to try and prevent, and then let's also have slightly more complex controls in place to keep that fraud detection more accurate. So thank you again for joining today's webinar. We have another webinar in 2 weeks today. We look forward to seeing you then. I'll be joined with Max by 2 guest speakers, one from First Abu Dhabi Bank and one from Credo Lab, and we'll be talking about harnessing alternative data and machine learning data to enhance your fraud and compliance decisioning. So look forward to seeing you there, and have a good rest of the day, and thank you again for joining. I'm going to close the session. Thanks.